Welcome, my dear friend. Let everything slow. There is a world in the Imperium where the land itself is trying to kill the people standing on it. Not the weather, though the weather is lethal. Not the predators, though they are among the worst in the galaxy. The ground. The islands that people live on rise out of the ocean, are inhabited for a season, and then sink back under, and the population has to be somewhere else when it happens. The Imperium classifies Fenris as a death world, and the classification understates it. Most death worlds are dangerous in a stable way. A jungle that stays a jungle. A desert that remains a desert. Fenris changes its own geography on a schedule, and the schedule kills whoever failed to read it correctly. Human beings live there anyway. They have for a very long time, and what that has done to them is the beginning of tonight's story. How the world works. Start with the mechanics, because they are unlike anything else in the setting. Fenris orbits its star on a path that produces 4 seasons of extreme character, rather than the mild variation most worlds experience. During the warm period, the polar ice melts on a scale that raises the ocean level past anything a temperate world sees, and land that was habitable goes under. During the cold period, the water freezes back and the seabed rises, and islands that had been beneath the waves return. The world is therefore never the same place twice. A settlement built in one generation may be underwater in the next, and the maps a tribe keeps are less geography than schedule. Volcanic activity runs alongside all of it. New land is thrown up. Existing land collapses. Storms of a violence that would flatten cities elsewhere are the ordinary weather of a Fenrisian autumn. And the seas are full of things that eat people. Kraken, sea serpents, predators of a size that make a longship a snack rather than a vessel. None of this is a disaster in Fenrisian terms. It is the arrangement, and it has been running for as long as anyone remembers. What living there produces? A population that survives those conditions for millennia becomes something particular, and Fenris has had a great deal of time. The people live in tribes, in longhouses, in settlements they know they will abandon. They sail. They raid each other, constantly, and without much malice, because raiding is how a tribe short on food in a bad season stays alive. They fight the sea creatures. They fight the ice. They fight the tribe across the water. Their culture is oral rather than written. What matters is remembered in saga, told, sung, and passed down, and a man standing rests on what will be said about him afterward. Technology has regressed to iron and sail. The Imperium's classification for this is feral world, and Fenris qualifies without argument. And the mortality is extraordinary. Children die at rates that would collapse most populations. Bad seasons remove settlements entirely. What survives to adulthood on Fenris has been selected by conditions that kill most of what they are applied to. That is the recruiting ground. The Space Wolves take their aspirants from this population, and they take them from the ones who are already exceptional by Fenrisian standards, which is a filter applied on top of a filter. The Fang. One structure dominates the world, and it is visible from orbit. The Fang is a mountain on the island of Asserheim, and Asserheim is the only landmass on Fenris that does not sink. Everything else is temporary. This one place stays. The mountain is enormous, tall enough that its peak reaches out of the atmosphere, and inside it the Space Wolves have built their fortress monastery. Hangars, halls, armories, forges, training grounds and living quarters carved down through the rock across 10,000 years. The Fenrisians below regard it as the seat of gods, They are not entirely wrong by their own lights. The beings who come down from that mountain are 8 feet tall, wear armor, and take away the strongest young men of every generation. And the Fang's position on the only permanent landmass says something about the arrangement. The chapter sits on the one piece of Fenris that will always be there, watching a world that rearranges itself, drawing recruits from a population that has to keep moving. The child in the snow. Into that world, at some point in the distant past, a gestation capsule came down. It landed in the far north, and what came out of it was an infant, and the infant did not die. He was found by wolves. Nothing about a Fenrisian wolf matches the terrestrial animal of that name. They are enormous, semi-sentient, and among the most dangerous predators on a world that specializes in dangerous predators. A human infant encountering a pack of them has one outcome under every ordinary circumstance. The pack took him in and raised him. He grew among them. He hunted with them. He learned their manner of moving and their manner of killing. And by the time any one human encountered him, he was running with the pack as one of them, on 4 limbs as often as 2. 2 wolves stayed with him afterward, all his life. Freki and Geri, and both names come from an older tradition than Fenris, which is one of several details in this story that the setting leaves unexplained. King Thengir. Men found him in the end, and the finding is one of the better scenes in the Primarch stories. King Thengir of the Russ tribe was hunting, and what his party encountered was a wolf pack containing something that was not a wolf. They took him. The accounts describe considerable difficulty in doing so. Thengir brought him back to his hall and raised him as a son, and the name he was given records the arrangement. Leman of the Russ, the foundling of the Russ tribe. The boy learned to walk upright, and to speak, and to behave as a man among men, and none of it took long. Primarch development runs at a rate no human childhood approaches, and within a very few years, Leman Russ was the strongest and most capable warrior in a tribe of extremely capable warriors. He became king when Thengir died. He then did what a Fenrisian king does, with an advantage of that size. He went to war with his neighbors and won, and kept winning, and by the time he stopped, a substantial portion of Asserheim answered to him. The stranger at the feast. Then a man came to his hall and asked him to submit. The Emperor of Mankind arrived on Fenris looking for his lost son, and the encounter that followed is the most told story in the Space Wolves' entire saga tradition, and it belongs here in full because it establishes everything about how this legion works. Russ refused. A Fenrisian king does not kneel to a stranger who walks into his hall making claims, however impressive the stranger looks. So the Emperor proposed a contest. 3 of them, in the Fenrisian manner: eating, drinking, and fighting. Russ won the eating contest. The accounts describe him consuming an entire roasted beast while the Emperor was still working through his portion. Russ won the drinking contest. He drank the Emperor under the table, and the sagas dwell on this at length and with obvious enjoyment. Then they fought, and the Emperor put him down, and Russ knelt. Hoi Train. What that story is doing. Consider what the Space Wolves preserve in that account, because the choice of what to remember is revealing. They remember that their Primarch beat the Emperor of Mankind at 2 things out of 3. That is the part the sagas emphasize and the part every Fenrisian child knows. They also remember the 3rd contest, and they do not minimize it. Russ lost the fight and accepted the outcome, and the acceptance was total. From that moment he served the Emperor without reservation, and his loyalty across the whole of the Great Crusade and the heresy never wavered by any account anyone has recorded. Set that beside the other primarch reunions this channel has covered. Ungron was taken by force. Lorgar was humiliated in the ashes of his own city. Conrad Kurz came aboard with murder in mind. Luther's foundling stood up in a forest and was reclaimed without ceremony. Russ was beaten in a fair fight after winning 2 and considered the matter settled and never raised it again. That is a Fenrisian resolution, and it is the cleanest of the 20. The Legion he received. The 6th Legion existed before he did, and what happened to it after his arrival is worth stating. They were Terran, raised on Terra in the earliest years, and their reputation in that period was for a particular kind of work. The Legion the Emperor used when a problem required something other than conquest. Their designation in some accounts is the Emperor's Executioners. Where other legions took worlds, the 6th was sent to end things. Populations that could not be brought into compliance. Enemies the Imperium wanted removed rather than integrated. Russ arrived and remade them in Fenris's image. The Legion became the Space Wolves, adopted Fenrisian custom wholesale, and reorganized itself into great companies under wolf lords, rather than into the standardized formations other legions used. But the older function did not go away. The Emperor continued to use the 6th Legion for the tasks nobody else was given, and this account will come back to that in 2 nights, because it is the darkest thing about them. What is in their blood? We close on the thing that separates this legion from every other, and it is not culture. The Space Wolves carry a genetic inheritance called the Canis Helix, taken from Leman Russ himself, and it does something to them that no other gene line does to its recipients. It gives them the senses of a predator. Fenrisian wolves are semi-sentient hunters with acute smell, hearing and sight, and the Canis Helix invests the Space Wolves with the same faculties. A Space Wolf can track by scent. He can hear things other Astartes cannot. His reactions run faster, and his instincts run closer to the surface. And it carries a price. The curse of the Wulfen is a genetic condition inherent in the Canis Helix, and what it does to a man is turn him into a beast, savage, malformed, and lupine, a parody of the brother he was. It takes some of them during their early training. It takes others centuries later, in the heat of battle, without warning, after a lifetime of service. Every Space Wolf carries it. The chapter has never eliminated it, has never been able to eliminate it, and the ceremony that makes a Fenrisian into a Space Wolf begins with drinking the very thing that will one day take him. Tomorrow, we look at that ceremony, and at what happens to the boys who do not survive it. Why it cannot be bred out. One further thing, stated tonight and examined properly later, because it changes the shape of the whole chapter. The Imperium tried to make more of them. The Wolf Brothers were founded as a successor chapter, drawn from Space Wolves' gene seed, intended as the first of many. They succumbed to the curse of the Wulfen at a rate that made the chapter unviable, and they were disbanded and scattered. There have been no further successors. The genetic code that produces the Space Wolves is regarded across the Imperium as too dangerous to copy, and the heritage that makes them formidable is the same heritage that makes their genome unstable, which leaves them alone. Every other first founding chapter in the Imperium has descendants. Blood Angels have a dozen, Ultramarines have hundreds, Dark Angels have their Unforgiven. The Space Wolves have nobody. One chapter on one world, carrying a gene line that cannot be reproduced, drawing its recruits from tribes who must keep moving because the ground keeps sinking beneath them. the sagas. Something about how this culture records itself deserves its own attention, because it explains why the Space Wolves are so difficult for the rest of the Imperium to deal with. They do not keep archives, they keep sagas. Every great company has a skald, a warrior poet, whose function is to witness what the company does and to compose the account of it. That account is spoken and sung rather than filed. It is performed in the halls of the Fang, learned by other schools, and carried forward by repetition, which means the chapter's institutional memory lives in poetry, and poetry has properties that record do not. It emphasizes, it shapes, it remembers the moment a wolf lord did something extraordinary and lets the supply arrangements around it fall away. The administratum finds this intolerable. A chapter asked to produce documentation of a campaign produces a song, and the song is accurate in the sense that matters to Fenris, and useless in the sense that matters to Terra. And there is a consequence that runs deeper. A culture that records in saga is a culture where a man's afterlife is his reputation. A space wolf fights for the account a skald will give of him in a hall once he is gone. Metaphor has nothing to do with it here. That is the mechanism by which the whole institution motivates itself. The great companies. The chapter's structure ignores the Codex Astartes, and the reason is Fenrisian rather than doctrinal. Where a Codex chapter is organized into 10 numbered companies with fixed roles, the Space Wolves are divided into 12 great companies, each commanded by a wolf lord, each with its own character, traditions, heraldry, and preferred way of fighting. A great company sits closer to a war band than to anything in the Codex, or to a Fenrisian tribe transposed into space. The Wolf Lord holds it by the loyalty of his warriors, rather than by an appointment from above, and no two companies resemble each other closely. Some are heavy on armor, some hunt on foot, some have reputations for particular kinds of war and are asked for by name. Above them sits the Great Wolf, who commands the chapter, and the arrangement between him and the Wolf Lords is closer to a king among jarls than to a colonel among captains, which produces the friction that has defined this chapter's relationship with the wider Imperium for 10,000 years. They will fight anywhere, and they will fight hard. They will not restructure themselves to match a manual, and Guilliman's Codex is a manual. The priesthoods. 3 offices exist in this chapter that other chapters either lack or handle differently, and each has a Fenrisian name and a strange function. The wolf priests combine the roles of chaplain and apothecary. They tend the wounded, recover gene seed from the dead, and lead the spiritual life of the company, and they are also the ones who go down to Fenris to select aspirants. A wolf priest decides which boys are taken. The rune priests are the chapter's psychers, and their existence is an act of open defiance. The Space Wolves primarch had strong opinions about sorcery, and this account will come to Prospero in 3 nights. Yet the chapter maintains psychers, calls them rune priests, dresses their powers in Fenrisian ritual, and insists that what they do is nothing like what the Thousand Sons did. The Inquisition has raised this point. The chapter's answer has been consistent and unhelpful, and the Iron Priests are the chapter's tech marines, trained on Mars and returned to Fenris, where they maintain the armor and the vehicles under a set of Fenrisian rites that the Adeptus Mechanicus finds theologically alarming. Every one of these offices is the Imperium's standard structure, taken and rebuilt in the shape of an Iceworld's traditions, and every one of them is a small argument the chapter is having with the institution it serves. What the rest of the Imperium makes of them. The Space Wolves' reputation deserves stating plainly, because it is worse than their record justifies, and better than their conduct sometimes deserves. They are regarded as barbarians. undisciplined, informal, contemptuous of protocol, given to drinking and boasting and open disagreement with superiors in front of subordinates. Some of that is accurate. A Space Wolf's Wolf Lord will tell an Imperial commander that a plan is stupid in front of the commander's own officers, using language the officers will remember, and some of it is a costume. The chapter's Wolf Lords are experienced commanders running formations that have held together for 10,000 years, and the roughness is partly a manner they have found useful. An organization that everybody expects to be crude is an organization nobody examines closely. Their relations with other chapters vary. With the Dark Angels, there is an antipathy that both sides trace back to the heresy and neither side discusses in full. With the Blood Angels, there is respect. With the Ultramarines, there is the Codex permanently in the room. The question underneath the Legion. We close the first night on the problem that the following 7 will keep returning to. The Space Wolves are a chapter of extremely dangerous men, drawn from a population bred by a world that kills the unfit, carrying a genetic inheritance that gives them predator senses, and periodically turns one of them into a monster. They are also loyal. That is worth stating clearly because everything else about them invites suspicion. Across 10,000 years, through the heresy and everything after, no Space Wolf great company has ever turned. The chapter's record on that is unblemished, and the Imperium has never trusted them. The gene seed is not permitted to be reproduced. The chapter's psychers are watched. Its structure is a standing violation of the Codex. Its recruitment world is a feral planet the Administratum can barely account for. And an inquisitorial faction has more than once concluded that the Space Wolves are a mutation risk that ought to be dealt with. A chapter that has never betrayed the Imperium has spent 100 centuries being regarded as a problem. By the Imperium, it has never betrayed. That tension runs under everything in this series. And it starts with a helix in the blood that nobody has ever been able to remove. Sleep well. Tomorrow we go up the Fang and into the ceremony where the wolf gets in. Somewhere in the making of a Space Wolf comes a moment when the outcome stops being anybody's decision. A boy is given something to drink. What happens next depends on what is already inside him, and nobody involved can predict it, and a proportion of the boys who drink do not come back as men. Tonight we go through the whole process, from a body in the snow to a warrior in grey armour, and we look at what the process costs. Chosen from the dead. The selection begins with a corpse, or something close to one. A wolf priest goes down from the Fang onto the world below, and what he looks for is a young Fenrisian who has died well. That phrasing is exact. The chapter does not recruit the strongest boy in a village or the best fighter in a tribe. It takes ones who have fallen. Warriors killed in a raid. Hunters brought down by the ice. Young men who went against something too large for them and were beaten by it. The wolf priest examines the fallen. What he is looking for is a death that says something about the man who suffered it. Courage or defiance, or the refusal to yield at a moment when yielding was available. And then he takes the body, if there is enough of it left, and carries it up the mountain. Consider what that means to the tribes below. The dead vanish from the ice. A young man falls in a raid, and his companions come back for the body, and the body is gone. And everyone in that culture knows what it means. The Fenrisians call them the Sky Warriors and regard the taking as an honor of the highest kind. A son who is taken has been chosen by the gods of the mountain. The first test. What arrives at the Fang is not always alive, and the first stage of the process addresses that. The chapter's apothecarian works on the body. Wounds are closed, systems restarted, and the young man is brought back from whatever state he arrived in, and this alone would be a miracle by the standards of the world he came from. Then he is held and observed, and the observation is the first assessment. What the chapter needs to know is whether there is anything in him worth the next stage, and the standards are severe. Those who fail here are not returned to their tribes. Some become servants within the Fang, living out their lives in the mountain among warriors they will never be. Others do not survive the assessment at all. Worskil, the cup. Then comes the part that separates this chapter from every other in the Imperium. The aspirant is given the cup of Wulfen to drink, and what is in it is the Canis Helix, the genetic inheritance taken from Leman Russ himself, described on the first night of this series. He drinks it, and it goes to work on him, and what it does is transform him from the inside. The physical change is enormous, and it is fast. Muscle mass increases, bone density increases, senses sharpen past the human range, hair grows, teeth lengthen. The body reorganizes itself into something far stronger and much less human than the boy who lifted the cup, and his mind goes with it. The transformation strips away the human personality and replaces it with something older. Reason recedes. Language recedes. What is left is instinct, appetite, and a predator's understanding of the world, and the young man who drank is no longer available to be spoken to. Sent into the snow. Then they let him out. The chapter releases the transformed aspirant into the wilds of Asserheim, alone, in that condition, and leaves him there. What follows is not a test in any structured sense. There is no objective, no time limit, and no assessor watching. The boy, who is no longer a boy, runs in the wilderness of a world that kills people in the shape of a beast, driven by the appetites the change has given him. Some of them die out there. The world does what it does to everything unprepared for it, and a creature running on instinct with no equipment and no plan is not exempt. Some of them do not die, and do not come back either. They stay out there permanently, and the accounts of Fenris include things in the wilderness that are not wolves and are not men, and some of them survive the phase and start, slowly, to come back to themselves. The change reaches a peak and then recedes, and the human personality reasserts itself. And what is standing in the snow at the end of it is a young man again, in a body that has been rebuilt. Those are the ones the chapter collects. Who comes back? The recovery is where the real selection happens, and the mechanism is worth stating with precision, because it explains the curse. Whether an aspirant comes back from the Wulfen state depends on his own will. The strength of the transformation is the same in every case. The strength of the mind resisting it is not. An aspirant with sufficient will emerges from the change, with the beast pushed down inside him, present but subordinate, and he becomes a space wolf. An aspirant without it does not emerge. The beast holds, and what walks out of that wilderness is a Wulfen, savage, malformed, permanently altered, and beyond recovery, which means the chapter's initiation is a contest between a young man and his own genetics, conducted alone in a frozen wilderness, with no assistance available and no way to prepare, and the ones who win do not win permanently. Bo. What the winners carry. Here is the fact that shapes every space wolf's entire life. The Wulfen state is never removed. It is suppressed. A space wolf who came back from that wilderness carries the beast inside him for the rest of his service. It sits under the surface, held down by the will that beat it the first time. And it does not go away, and it does not weaken. It can rise again. In the heat of battle, under extremity, in circumstances nobody can predict. A space wolf who has served for 3 centuries can feel it coming back up, Some hold it, some do not. The chapter's own understanding is that the curse takes brothers at any point in their career without pattern, and that a warrior's success in resisting it once is no guarantee about the next time. A Wolfguard veteran with 200 years of service is every bit as vulnerable as a Bloodclaw in his first battle, and both of them know it. Bringing him in. For those who return, the remaining stages follow the pattern other chapters use, with Fenrisian additions. The gene seed organs are implanted, and the Space Wolves receive the standard 19 implants along with 2 of their own. The helix has already done its work by this point. What follows builds the Astartes physiology on top of it. He is then assigned to a great company. A Wolf Lord takes him, and from that moment the company is his household, his tribe and his family. And the loyalty runs to the Wolf Lord in a way that Codex chapters would find alarming. And he is given a place in the progression that runs through a Space Wolf's whole career. Baktal, Bloodclaw, Grey Hunter, Long Fang. The chapter's ranks describe a life rather than a hierarchy, and the names are the clearest thing about them. A Bloodclaw is the newest, young, transformed, full of the appetite the change gave him, and close to uncontrollable. Bloodclaws fight in packs, charge without being told to, and are used by their officers as a weapon that gets pointed rather than commanded. Their casualty rate is what you would expect. A Grey Hunter is what a Bloodclaw becomes if he lives. Experienced, still fast, still dangerous, but the appetite has been brought under control, and the judgment has arrived. The Grey Hunters are the chapter's core, and most of a great company's strength sits here. A Long Fang is old, centuries of service, slower than he was, and moved onto the heavy weapons where experience matters more than speed. A Long Fang has seen a great many brothers taken by battle and by the curse, and the chapter's heavy support is manned by warriors who have watched more of that than anyone else in the formation. Above them sit the Wolf Guard, the veterans of every stage drawn into the Wolf Lord's personal retinue in Terminator armor. Consider what that progression describes. A Space Wolf spends his youth barely in control of himself, his middle life mastering it, and his old age carrying the weight of everyone who did not. Cha. The ones who do not come back. We close on the population the chapter does not discuss with outsiders. Somewhere in the wilderness of Asserheim, there are the ones who stayed. Aspirants who went into the change and never returned from it, living in the ice, in a form that is neither the boy who drank nor the wolf that took him. The chapter knows they are out there. It does not hunt them, and it does not recover them. What it does is regard them as part of the world, in the way that everything else on Fenris that kills people is part of the world. And every Space Wolf in that mountain went into the same wilderness in the same condition and came back and knows precisely how close it was. That is what stands behind the chapter's reputation for savagery, and it is worth setting beside the barbarian manner described last night. These are men who have personally met the thing inside them in the snow without help, and won by an amount none of them can measure. They are cheerful about it. That is the strangest part, and this account will keep coming back to it. The 2 extra organs. The Space Wolves receive 2 implants no other chapter has, and both are physical expressions of what the Canis Helix has already done. The Os Modular and the Standard 19 are common to all Astartes. On top of those, a Space Wolf develops the Canis Helix organs, one that produces the acute predator senses our opening night described, and one that governs the hair growth, the tooth development, and the physical coarsening that marks a Fenrisian brother out from a marine of any other chapter. That is why they look the way they do. A space wolf's fangs, the greying hair that comes early and stays, the sheer size that runs slightly above other Astartes. None of it is affectation. It is organ function. And the apothecarian cannot separate the two effects. The senses and the coarsening come from the same source, and the source is the same one that produces the Wulfen state. To remove the risk would be to remove the chapter's defining advantages along with it. The chapter's position, stated with a bluntness the Imperium finds unhelpful, is that they would not want it removed. Sitzer, why the gene seed cannot leave Fenris. The first night mentioned the Wolf brothers and their disbandment. The detail deserves proper treatment here, because it is the reason the Space Wolves have no successors. The Wolf brothers were founded from Space Wolves' gene seed as a second founding chapter, and they went wrong. The curse took them at a rate the parent chapter never suffers. Whole squad succumbed. The proportion of brothers lost to the Wulfen state rose past anything an operational formation could absorb, and within a short span, the chapter was no longer viable. They were disbanded. What survivors there were scattered, and the Imperium's conclusion was recorded and has never been revisited. This gene line does not reproduce safely outside Fenris. Why the parent chapter manages what its successor could not has never been established. Theories point at Fenris itself, the world's own conditions, the population it draws on, the selection process, or something in the initiation that does not travel. What the Imperium took from it is simpler. No further attempts. The Space Wolves are permitted to exist and are not permitted to multiply. What happens to a brother who turns? There is a question this account has left hanging, and the answer is unlike anything in the Blood Angel's arrangement that this channel described elsewhere. A space wolf who succumbs in battle is not immediately destroyed. The chapter's own position on the Wulfen has shifted across its history, and for a long period the official line was that the curse was a shameful thing to be hidden from outsiders and dealt with quietly. Brothers who turned were removed from the order of battle, and what happened to them afterward was the wolf priest's business. The 13th company enters here, and it gets a full night later in this series. What matters now is the shape. The chapter has, at various points, kept its Wulfen rather than killing them, which produces a formation of brothers who lost the fight against their own blood, maintained by a chapter that regards them as still theirs. Deployed under circumstances the Inquisition would find very interesting if the Inquisition were told. And in the current era, following events this series will reach, the chapter's attitude has changed again in a direction that has made its relationship with the Imperium a great deal worse. What the Fenrisians below are told. One more perspective belongs in tonight's account, because it is the one the chapter shapes most deliberately. The people of Fenris have a religion, and the Space Wolves are in it. The tribes below understand the Sky Warriors as beings from the mountain who take the worthy dead. They do not know about gene seed, implants, or the Imperium. They know that a young man who dies well may be taken, and that the taken serve among the gods. The chapter maintains this. It does not correct the theology, does not explain itself, and does not interfere with the tribes except to take from them, which is a recruitment system of enormous efficiency. A population that believes being taken is the highest honor available. Produces aspirants who arrive already convinced, and a culture built around dying well produces precisely the deaths the wolf priests are looking for. The chapter has, across 10,000 years, shaped its own recruiting ground into a machine for generating the right kind of young man, and it has done so by leaving a religion in place and letting it work. What it all amounts to. We close on the accounting, because the process described tonight is harsher than any equivalent in the Imperium. A boy is born on a world that kills most of its children. He survives that. He grows into a warrior in a culture that fights constantly, and he dies in a manner that shows something about him. His body is taken up a mountain, restarted, assessed, and given a cup that turns him into an animal. He is released into a frozen wilderness alone, in that state, and either his own will brings him back or it does not. If it does, he is rebuilt into an Astartes and given to a wolf lord, and he spends the rest of his life carrying the thing he beat, knowing it can rise again at any moment, in any battle, after any span of service. And at every stage of that, the chapter's own people describe the process with enthusiasm. There is no equivalent anywhere else. The Blood Angel's flaw is a tragedy the chapter mourns. The Dark Angel's shame is a secret the chapter hides. The Space Wolves' curse is a thing they drink on purpose, in a cup, at the start, and then joke about for 400 years. Sleep well. Tomorrow the Great Crusade begins, and the Emperor finds a use for this legion that nobody else was given. The Great Crusade was a project of conquest, and most of the legions were instruments of conquest. They took worlds, they brought populations into compliance, defeated whatever resisted, installed imperial authority, and moved on to the next system. That was the work, and 18 legions did it across 200 years. The Sixth had another function alongside that one, and the Imperium has never been comfortable discussing it. When a thing needed ending rather than conquering, the Emperor sent the wolves. What the title means. They were called the Emperor's executioners, and the phrase was not decorative. Compliance is a process with stages. An expeditionary fleet arrives, terms are offered, resistance is broken, and the world joins the Imperium. Most campaigns of the Great Crusade follow that shape, and most legions spent their careers running it. Execution is what happens when the process has been declined past the point of usefulness, or when the Imperium has decided that a population should not exist. The Space Wolves did that work. They were the Emperor's instrument of punishment, and their arrival at a system meant something quite different from the arrival of the Ultramarines or the Imperial Fists. When the 6th Legion appeared in orbit, the negotiating had finished, and the Legion embraced it. Leman Russ regarded himself as the Emperor's most loyal son and his executioner, and he took the role without apparent difficulty. The punishments the Master of Mankind required were, in his understanding, his to deliver. Whether they were really sent. There is a question underneath the title that the setting has never settled, and it deserves flagging early because it changes how the rest of tonight reads. Nobody can establish whether the Emperor formally appointed them to that role. The Space Wolves believe they were the Emperor's executioners. That belief is consistent, ancient, and central to how the Legion understood itself. Whether the Emperor ever said so in those terms is another matter entirely. Some readings hold that the arrangement was official, a sanctioned function, assigned to the Legion best suited to it. Others hold that Russ assumed the mantle, that his Legion took up the role because it fitted them and because their primarch believed it was expected, and that the Emperor permitted the belief without ever confirming it. The distinction carries enormous weight and nothing resolves it. A legion carrying out sanctioned executions is an instrument of state. A legion that has decided it is the executioner and acts accordingly is something else. Russ never raised the question. He was not a man who asked whether an order had been given when he was already certain what the answer would be. The two legions nobody talks about. The darkest possibility attached to the 6th Legion belongs here, flagged as speculation rather than fact. 2 of the 20 legions were expunged. The 2nd and the 11th were removed from Imperial records so thoroughly that their names, their primarchs, their homeworlds and their fates are absent from every source the Imperium retains. Something was done to them. That much is certain, because legions do not vanish from a bureaucracy this comprehensive by accident, and it has been hinted in Imperial sources that the Space Wolves may have had something to do with it. Nothing confirms this. No account states what happened, who ordered it, or what the two legions did to warrant it. What exists is the suggestion, in material the Imperium produced, that the Emperor's executioners were used on 2 of the Emperor's own legions. If that is what happened, then this chapter's 10,000 years of loyalty rests on a foundation that includes the destruction of their own brothers, and the chapter itself does not know the details any better than the Inquisition does. The sagas do not sing about it. That silence is the only evidence available, and it is not evidence of anything. Wulfen and the Lion. Now the incident that produced the chapter's oldest feud, and the accounts of it disagree in a manner that is itself informative. The Wulfen campaign was a war against the Fash, a technologically advanced human civilization, whose ships were fast enough to escape any straight pursuit. Both the Space Wolves and the Dark Angels were committed to it, and the two primarchs were on the same trail with almost no contact between them. Russ wanted to reach Wulfen first. The reason was political. There were voices in the Imperial Court who had arranged for the First Legion to become involved, and Russ intended to answer them by arriving ahead of his brother. The Lion got there first. He identified the location from signs in the old annals, and his fleet was in position before the Wolves arrived. What happened next depends on which chapter is telling it. Two accounts of the same duel. The Space Wolves version is that the Lion advanced his legion without coordinating with his allies. The advance won the battle swiftly. It also left the Space Wolves' flank unprotected against a counterattack, and a great many of them were killed as a result. Russ challenged him to a duel afterward, and the challenge was about that. The Dark Angels tell it differently, and this channel covered their chapter's habits with the truth in a recent series. In their account, Russ was drunk, boastful, and struck first, and the Lion responded to an insult rather than to a grievance. Both chapters agree on the outcome. They fought, and the Lion knocked Russ flat on his back, and the Dark Angels departed, and the tradition that came out of it has lasted 100 centuries. Whenever the two chapters meet, selected champions from each side fight a duel, and the duel is usually non-lethal, and neither chapter will explain to outsiders what it is for. 10,000 years of ritual combat, twice a generation, over an argument that two dead primarchs never resolved, and that neither side's account of can be verified. The Night of the Wolf. The second great confrontation of the crusade was worse, and it was with a brother who was already lost. Angron had implanted the butcher's nails in his legion. The World Eaters had followed him into the practice. The Genna massacre had made the consequences public, and the Emperor censured him and ordered the surgery stopped. Angron refused. Russ was dispatched to bring him back to Terra to answer for it, and what followed is called the Night of the Wolf. The two legions clashed. It was brief and it was bloody. and Russ engaged Angren in single combat and lost. That defeat was arranged. Russ held back during the duel, and while Angren was occupied with beating him, the Space Wolves maneuvered around the World Eaters and encircled them. Then Russ explained the position. Angren had won the fight and lost the battle, and the reason was that he had abandoned command of his legion in order to indulge his own bloodlust. The point was pedagogical. This is what your appetite costs you. Angron refused to stand down. He did not understand what Russ had been attempting, and would not understand it until Lorgar explained it to him much later, long after both of them had gone over to Chaos. Russ ordered the withdrawal, and the accounts describe him as howling when he gave the order, and the reason given is that he had understood his brother was beyond reach. What that incident says about him. Consider what Russ was doing there, because it undercuts the reputation. The Emperor's executioner was sent to a primarch who had defied an imperial order, and he did not execute him. He designed an elaborate demonstration instead, accepted a personal defeat as part of it, and attempted to teach a lesson to a brother whose condition made teaching impossible. And when it failed, he withdrew rather than pressing the matter to its conclusion. A butcher does not do that. Whatever else Leman Russ was, the man who fought Angron on that night was trying to save him, and the barbarian manner our opening night set out conceals a commander with rather more subtlety than his reputation allows. The sagas keep that engagement. What they emphasize is the encirclement rather than the duel, which suggests that the Space Wolves understood perfectly well what their primarch had been doing. Arc Reach, Secundus. One more confrontation belongs to this period, and it is the one that matters most for what comes next. At Arc Reach Secundus, the Space Wolves and the Thousand Suns came close to open fighting over the fate of a great library. Russ and Magnus disagreed about what should be done with the accumulated knowledge of a compliant world. The disagreement escalated. Two legions stood facing each other, and the primarchs came close to blows before the situation was contained. Nothing decisive happened. No blood was shed between the legions, and the incident was resolved without a war. But the two primarchs came out of it with a settled understanding of each other. Russ regarded Magnus as a sorcerer who had been permitted too much latitude. Magnus regarded Russ as a barbarian incapable of appreciating what he was destroying. Both of them were correct in the narrow sense, and both of them were about to matter a very great deal. Because when the Emperor decided that the Thousand Suns had gone too far, he had a legion whose function was punishment, whose primarch already disliked Magnus, and whose relationship with sorcery was hostile. He sent the wolves. What the crusade cost them. We close on the legion's own losses, because they are heavier than the reputation suggests. The Wheel of Fire campaign took a third of the legion. That is an enormous casualty rate for a formation of that size, and among the dead were the majority of the legion's remaining Terran recruits, which completed a process that had been running since Russ arrived. The 6th Legion had been raised on Terra, and it ended the crusade as a Fenrisian institution with almost nothing of its original character left. The men who had served the Emperor before there was a primarch died in the Wheel of Fire, and what remained was Fenris. There was one recovery from that period that the Imperium remembers with more enthusiasm. During a campaign against the Nomen Xenos, the Space Wolves located a standard template construct printout for a battle tank, and the Mechanicum named the resulting design after their primarch. The Leman Russ battle tank is now the most numerous armoured vehicle in the Imperium. Millions of them, on every front, crewed by Astra Militarum tank crews who have never met a space wolf and know the name only as a marking on a hull. That is the Sixth Legion's largest contribution to the Imperium, and it arrived by accident in a campaign nobody remembers from a legion whose actual function nobody wants written down. How they fought. The Legion's method deserves description because the reputation for berserk savagery is misleading and the truth is more interesting. They hunted. A Space Wolves campaign begins with tracking. The Legion identifies where the enemy is, what it depends on, and where it will be forced to stand, and it applies pressure until the target has nowhere left to go. Only then does the fighting start. That approach comes from Fenris, where a hunting party that engages a target before the ground is right does not come back. It is a predator's logic rather than a soldier's, and it produces campaigns that look chaotic from outside and are anything but. Russ himself fought at the front of every engagement, with a frostblade at the head of the pack. That part of the reputation is accurate. The howling that announced his arrival was real and it was deliberate. An enemy that can hear a legion coming and cannot see. It is an enemy already losing. And they brought wolves. Fenrisian wolves accompanied the legion into war. And the sight of Astartes fighting alongside semi-sentient predators the size of horses did a great deal for the Sixth's reputation, and nothing at all for the Imperium's comfort with them. Why the other legions disliked them. The Sixth had poor relations with a remarkable number of their brother legions, and the pattern is worth laying out. The Dark Angels over Dulan, the World Eaters over that night on Malkoya, which Angron never forgave and never understood, the Thousand Suns over Archreach Secundus and everything that followed from it, and a general wariness from the rest, for a reason that had nothing to do with any individual incident. The Space Wolves were the legion the Emperor sent to punish legions. Every primarch in the Crusade knew that if he went too far, the wolves were what arrived, and it is difficult to feel warmly toward a brother who might one day be sent to end you. Russ appears to have understood this and to have found it acceptable. A legion that everybody is slightly afraid of is a legion whose arrival changes behavior before a shot is fired, and that is useful to an executioner. What it cost him was allies. When the heresy came and the loyalist legions needed each other, the Sixth had a shorter list of friends than almost anybody. The great companies at war. The organizational structure described on our opening night had consequences in the field that other legions found baffling. A Space Wolves force deploys as great companies, and each great company fights according to its Wolf Lord's judgment, rather than to a legion-wide plan. Russ set objectives. How they were achieved was the Wolf Lord's business, which means a Space Wolves army does not maneuver as one body. It arrives as a dozen semi-independent formations with a shared target, each commanded by a warrior who has been given latitude and expects to use it. Coordinating with such a force is difficult. An Imperial Army General who asks the Space Wolves to hold a line receives 12 separate answers, delivered by 12 commanders who all consider themselves the appropriate person to give one. And it works. That is the part their critics find hardest. The structure that looks like indiscipline from outside produces a force that adapts faster than any codex formation, because the decision is being made by the man who can see the ground, rather than by the man reading a report about it. What the Legion believed about itself. We close on the self-image, because it is the thing the heresy will test. The Space Wolves of the Great Crusade believed 3 things without reservation. They believed they were the Emperor's most loyal legion. Russ said it openly, and his warriors repeated it, and no evidence has ever contradicted it. They believed their function was to deliver the Emperor's judgment, and that the judgment was not theirs to question. The executioner does not adjudicate. He is told, and he acts. And they believed that being feared by their brothers was the price of that function and worth paying. All three of those beliefs are about to be tested by an order that arrives at Prospero, gets changed on the way, and turns out to have been something other than what either party thought it was. Sleep well. Tomorrow, they are sent to a world of libraries, with orders that changed on the way. Prospero was a city of glass towers on a quiet world, and what it held was knowledge. The 1,000 Sons had spent the Great Crusade gathering it, texts, artifacts, records, the accumulated learning of 100 worlds, catalogued and preserved in libraries that had no equal anywhere in the Imperium. Their primarch was the most gifted scholar of the 20, and his legion was built in his image. Tonight the wolves arrive. What Magnus had done. The chain that leads here begins with an act of loyalty. Magnus the Red discovered that Horus had turned. He had the means to warn terror, and no time to do it by ordinary channels, so he used the one method available to him. He sent his mind across the galaxy and delivered the warning into his father's mind. It worked. The Emperor received the warning, and the working tore through the webway project beneath the Imperial Palace, breaking wards the Emperor had spent decades constructing, and opening the passages under terror to things that came through. The damage was severe, and it was permanent, and the Emperor's own great work never recovered from it. Magnus had also, in doing this, broken the ruling of Nicaea that this account described last night. He knew that when he did it, his own accounts describe a man who understood the prohibition, understood the risk, and judged that a warning about the War Master's treachery outweighed both. He was right about the treachery. The method destroyed something the Imperium could not replace. Dad. The order that changed. The Emperor's response was to send the 6th Legion to Prospero, and the substance of that order is the most consequential textual question in the entire heresy. By the account the setting preserves, the original instruction was to bring Magnus to Terra. Arrest. A primarch summoned to answer for what he had done, escorted by the legion best suited to compelling a primarch who did not want to come. Horus was War Master. All communications between Terra and the legions passed through his command, and Horus, who had every reason to want the 1,000 Sons destroyed or driven into chaos, altered what Russ received. The order that reached the Wolf King was an instruction to destroy Prospero. Russ took it as lawful. It came through the proper channel, bearing the proper authority, and it was the kind of order his legion had been receiving for 200 years. He went. What Magnus did about it. Here is the detail that makes Prospero unbearable, rather than merely tragic. Magnus knew they were coming. The means were his to use, and he used them. And the 1,000 Sons had warning. He forbade his legion to prepare. His reasoning, by his own account, was that he deserved it. He had broken the ruling. He had damaged his father's work. What was coming was a judgment he had earned, and to resist it would be to compound the offense. So the most powerful psychic legion in the Imperium, on a world of libraries defended by wards its primarch could have raised, stood down and waited. Some of his officers disobeyed him. Azek Ahriman, among others, prepared what defenses they could against orders, because they could see what their primarch was choosing. It was not enough. Prospero's defenses had been deliberately weakened by the one man who could have made them impassable. The attack. The Space Wolves came in hard, and they did not come alone. The Sisters of Silence were with them, null maidens, blanks, women whose presence suppresses psychic power in a radius around them. Against the Thousand Suns, this is the single most effective weapon that exists, and their inclusion in the Force says something about how the operation was planned. The Custodian Guard came too, which places the Emperor's own household troops in the assault. The fleet arrived and burned the defences from orbit. The landing followed, and what happened on the ground was a legion of scholars, forbidden to use the thing that made them formidable, meeting a legion of executioners who had been sent to end them. The glass towers came down, the libraries burned. The accumulated knowledge of the Great Crusade's greatest collection was destroyed in a matter of hours, and what was not destroyed was scattered. The two primarchs. Russ and Magnus met. The fight was not close. Magnus had refused to defend himself properly, and had spent his strength holding what remained of his legion together, and Russ was a primarch at full strength who had come to carry out an order. He broke Magnus's back. That is the recorded outcome, and it is the moment the Thousand Suns story pivots. Magnus, defeated, dying, with his legion being destroyed around him, took the offer that had been waiting for him. Tzeentch had been patient. Magnus accepted, and the surviving Thousand Suns were pulled out of Prospero and into the planet of the sorcerers in the Eye of Terror, and the legion that had been punished for risking corruption became corrupted by the punishment. What the wolves found out afterward. The Space Wolves learned the truth of it later, and the learning came too late to matter. Horus declared himself. The heresy became open, and the alteration of the order to Prospero became visible in retrospect, along with everything else the War Master had been arranging. Russ had been used. The legion that prided itself on being the Emperor's blade had been picked up and swung by somebody else, at a target the Emperor had not chosen, and the result was the destruction of a loyal legion and its delivery into the hands of chaos. The chapter's saga tradition handles this with more honesty than one might expect. Prospero is not sung about as a victory. The Space Wolves' own accounts treat it as a wound, and the wound is that they were the instrument rather than the author. What they cannot say. And there is a question underneath that the chapter has never resolved, which this account raised last night and returns to here. Would Russ have refused a lawful order to destroy Prospero? Nothing in his record suggests he would. The Sixth Legion had spent 2 centuries carrying out assignments of precisely this kind. Russ described himself as the Emperor's executioner and meant it. The order that arrived was of a kind he had received and executed many times, which means the deception mattered less than it appears to. Horus altered the order and Russ obeyed the altered version, and if the original had been the harsher one, Russ would have obeyed that too. The chapter's defense is that they were deceived. The uncomfortable version is that they were the legion you send when you want something destroyed, and Horus knew it, and used them precisely because he could rely on them not to hesitate. Being reliable was the vulnerability. What came back to Fenris? We close on the aftermath, because Prospero did not stay on Prospero. The Thousand Suns came back. Magnus, restored and elevated, brought his legion to Fenris in an assault that this series will return to, and what he did there was aimed at the Fang, and at the chapter's own gene stock. The Space Wolves have been fighting the Thousand Suns ever since. It is the longest continuous feud in the setting, running for 10,000 years, and both sides regard the other as the author of their own worst hour. Magnus blames the wolves for the destruction of Prospero and everything that followed. The wolves blame Magnus for breaking a ruling they had supported, for damaging the Emperor's work, and for the fact that they were sent. Neither of them blames Horus as much as either blames the other, and the deception that started the whole thing sits underneath a hatred that has outlasted every person who was there. Astasi, the Sisters of Silence. The inclusion of the Null Maidens deserves its own section, because their presence changes what the operation was. A blank is a human being born without a soul in the warp sense. They register as an absence. Psychic power fails around them. Demons recoil from them. And a psyker in a blank's presence loses access to everything that makes him a psyker. The Sisters of Silence are an order of them, trained, armed, and used by the Imperium against one category of problem and no other. Their deployment to Prospero means the assault was designed against a psychic legion at the planning stage. Somebody looked at the target and assembled a force calculated to strip the Thousand Suns of their central advantage before the fighting started, which raises a question the setting leaves hanging. If the original order was arrest rather than destruction, the force composition was already suited to either. Whoever assembled it had built an instrument that would work whichever version of the order arrived. What burned? The material loss at Prospero is worth stating plainly, because it is the part the Imperium never recovered. The Thousand Suns had spent 2 centuries collecting, not looting, collecting in order and by method, with the Legion's scholars cataloguing what they found across every world the Crusade touched. Texts from human civilizations that predated the Imperium. Records of the dark age of technology. Artifacts nobody else recognized the significance of. Xenos material studied rather than destroyed. And the Legion's own accumulated work on psychic phenomena, which was the largest body of knowledge on the subject humanity had ever assembled. All of it was in those towers. Consider what the Imperium of the 41st millennium looks like. An institution drowning in ignorance, unable to build what it once built, hoarding fragments it cannot read. A great deal of what it lost was lost at Prospero, on a single day, by its own hand. The Space Wolves burned a library because an order told them to, and the Imperium has been poorer for 10,000 years. The ones who disobeyed Magnus. Ahriman's position at Prospero deserves marking because it makes the Thousand Suns' later history stranger. Magnus forbade preparation. Several of his senior officers ignored him and prepared anyway, and Asek Ahriman was among the most active of them. They were right. Their primarch's decision was a moral judgment that cost his legion its existence, and the officers who disobeyed him were attempting to save the people under their command. And Ahriman goes on, after Prospero, to perform the rubric, the working intended to save his brothers from the mutation consuming them, which instead reduced most of the legion to dust animated inside empty armor. 2 acts of disobedience, both from the same man, both intended to protect his legion. The first was correct and insufficient. The second was catastrophic. This channel covered the rubric at length in another series. What belongs here is the observation that the Thousand Suns' destruction runs through a sequence of people trying to do the right thing and being wrong about what it was. The sagas that do not sing. One thing about the Space Wolves' own record of Prospero is worth noticing, and it concerns what they leave out. The chapter's saga tradition is enormous, and our opening night set out how it works. A warrior poet attached to each company, every campaign of consequence turned into verse, and Fenrisian oral memory reaches back to the crusade. Prospero has no great saga. There are accounts of it. The chapter does not deny the campaign or hide it, but the tradition that turns everything else this legion has done into performed poetry has never produced the equivalent for the day they burned a world of libraries at somebody else's instruction. A culture that sings about its victories and its glorious defeats has stayed quiet about the one operation that achieved every objective and should never have happened. That silence is the closest thing to an admission the Space Wolves have ever made. What neither legion can do. We close on the shape of the feud, because 10,000 years have made it unresolvable. Magnus cannot forgive the wolves. They destroyed his world, killed his sons, broke his back, and drove what remained of his legion into the arms of a god he had spent his life arguing was not worth serving. The wolves cannot forgive Magnus. He broke the ruling they had backed, wrecked the Emperor's own work, and made himself the reason they were sent to do the worst thing in their history. And both of those positions are defensible from inside, and neither party is in a position to hear the other. And the man who arranged for them to destroy each other has been in the eye of terror since before either of them had time to work out what he had done. Horus got both legions with one altered order. The 1,000 Suns went to chaos. The Space Wolves acquired a reputation as the Imperium's attack dogs and a permanent enemy. The War Master never had to fight either of them to achieve it. Sleep well. Tomorrow the heresy runs its course, and a legion arrives at Terra to find the war already decided. The heresy ran for years, and the 6th Legion fought through all of it. They were mauled at Prospero's aftermath, harried across the Alaxis Nebula by the Alpha Legion, and driven into a defensive campaign that cost them heavily before they could reassemble. They came to Terra late, and the siege had already been decided by the time they arrived. Tonight, we follow Russ through the end of the war and past it, to the day he walked out of his own fortress and did not come back. Alaxis. The immediate aftermath of Prospero nearly finished the Legion, and the mechanism was characteristic of the enemy who used it. The Alpha Legion caught the wolves in the Alaxis Nebula, and what followed was a campaign of ambush, deception, and attrition against a fleet already damaged and low on supply. Alpharius fought the way the Alpha Legion always fights. Never in open engagement, never where the enemy's strength could be brought to bear, always through the seams. The wolves could not find him. They could only absorb what he did to them and keep moving. The Legion survived. It survived reduced, and it emerged from that nebular understanding that the war it was now in had rules its 2 centuries of executioner's work had not prepared it for. Russ's response to the whole experience is recorded in a phrase the chapter has kept. The wolves were being hunted. Terra. They reached Terra after the siege was over. The Emperor was on the Golden Throne. Horus was dead. Sanguinius was dead. The palace was in ruins, and the war for the Imperium had been decided by the legions who had been there for it. The Space Wolves' arrival was into the aftermath, rather than into the battle, and this is a charge that has followed them in the same way it followed the Dark Angels. As this channel described in another series, the circumstances were different. The wolves had been fighting continuously and had been prevented from reaching Terra by enemies working to that end. The Alpha Legion's campaign at Alaxis was, among other things, an operation to keep the 6th away from the decisive theatre. What Russ did on arrival is the part worth stating. he did not stop to grieve or to consult. He went straight into the scouring. The long campaign that pushed the traitor legions out of Imperial space and penned them in the eye. And the wolves fought through it with a ferocity that other legions found notable even by the standards of that period. What he said about the Codex. Then Leman produced the Codex Astartes, and Russ produced an opinion. The Codex broke the legions into chapters of 1,000. Its reasoning was sound. No individual again should command the force that Horus had commanded, and the concentration of power that made the heresy possible had to be dismantled. Russ did not agree. The accounts of his response range from cold refusal to open contempt, and the chapter's own tradition holds that he came close to fighting Leman over it. What is recorded is that the Space Wolves accepted the division and then implemented it in a manner that preserved almost everything the Codex was meant to remove. They split into chapters on paper. The great companies stayed intact. The Wolf Lords kept their independence. The chapter's structure of 12 companies under a great wolf went on working precisely as the Legion's structure had, and the chapter's own recruiting and gene seed remained on Fenris under the chapter's control, which was the very arrangement the Codex had been drawn up to break apart. The Space Wolves have been in technical compliance and practical defiance ever since. The Last Feast. Some years after the heresy, Russ called his great companies together at the Fang and held a feast. The accounts of that night are among the most quoted passages in the chapter's saga tradition, and what makes them significant is that everybody present understood something was happening and nobody was told what. He drank, he talked, he spoke to his wolf lords individually, in a manner several of them recorded afterward as final, and he named a successor. Bjorn, who had fought beside him since the Crusade, was raised to Great Wolf, and the naming was done in the hall in front of everyone. Then Russ left. What he said. The words he left are the most argued over sentence in the chapter's history. He told them he was going to the Eye of Terror, into the warp, and that he would return. He said, "The Wolftime is coming." And he told them he would come back for the Wolftime at the end, when the final battle came, to fight beside the Allfather one last time. Then he walked out of the Fang with a small number of companions and was not seen again. What the chapter believes. The Space Wolves have never treated this as a death. Every other first founding chapter that lost its primarch treats the loss as a loss. The Blood Angels mourn Sanguinius. The Dark Angels believe the Lion dead for 10,000 years, as this channel described. The Space Wolves do not mourn Russ. They wait for him. No fringe holds that belief, and nothing about it is decorative. It is doctrine. The Wolftime is coming. Russ will return for it, and the chapter's function in the intervening period is to be ready when he does, which produces a particular quality in this chapter, that this account has been circling for 5 nights. The Space Wolves are cheerful, they fight hard and they enjoy it, and they do not carry the weight the other first founding chapters carry. And the reason is that their Primarch told them he was coming back, and they believed him. Why he went. The question of what Russ was doing has several answers, and the setting has not settled among them. The chapter's own account is the simplest. He went to prepare. Something at the end requires preparation, and Russ went to do it, and he will be back when the preparation is complete. Another reading points at the 13th Company, which vanished around the same period, and which this series covers in 2 nights. Under that reading, Russ went into the Eye of Terror on an operation, and the company went with him or after him, and what they were doing was a war nobody outside the chapter knew about. A third reading is harder. Russ had burned Prospero on a forged order. He had been used, and a primarch who has done the worst thing in his legion's history on somebody else's instruction may have had his own reasons for going, unconnected to any prophecy. Nothing in the record settles it. What is certain is that he told his chapter he would return, and that the chapter has been running on that promise for 100 centuries. Bjorn. We close on the man he left in charge, because Bjorn is still alive. Bjorn the Fell-Handed fought in the Great Crusade. He was there for Prospero, for the heresy, for the scouring, and for the last feast, and he was named Great Wolf by Russ himself in that hall. He was mortally wounded some time afterward and interred in a dreadnought, and he has been in it ever since, which makes him the oldest living loyalist space marine in the Imperium. By a margin nothing else approaches. Dante of the Blood Angels has 1100 years. Bjorn has 10,000. He sleeps. The chapter keeps him in stasis and wakes him for matters of the highest importance. And when he is woken, he speaks. And what he says is the only direct testimony from the Crusade era that anybody in the Imperium possesses. He knew Russ. He knew the Emperor. He was in the room for things the rest of the setting knows only through fragments. And the chapter treats those wakings as sacred, because a dreadnought that remembers the Great Crusade is the closest thing to a living archive the Space Wolves have, and their entire tradition is oral. Why the Codex fight mattered. The argument with Leman deserves more than a paragraph, because the Space Wolves' position had substance, and the setting rarely gives it a hearing. Leman's case is straightforward and mostly right. A single primarch commanding 100,000 Astartes brought the Imperium to the edge of destruction, and no arrangement that permits it again is safe. Russ's objection was practical rather than sentimental. The great companies work because a Wolf Lord commands men who chose him and who will follow him into anything. That relationship takes decades to build, and it does not transfer to an organizational chart. Break the Legion into standardized units with rotating officers, and you preserve the numbers and lose whatever it was that made them dangerous. There is also the harder point, which Russ did not make out loud, and which his conduct implies. The Codex was written by a primarch who had not been asked to do what the Sixth Legion had been asked to do. A force built for the Imperium's worst assignments cannot be run by a manual written for its ordinary ones. That compliance in name only has been an open argument across 100 centuries, and the Ultramarines have never stopped noticing. Two versions of the feast. One detail about the last night at the Fang deserves separating out, because the chapter's own accounts disagree about it. Some versions describe Russ as calm, deliberate and clear about what he was doing. He set his affairs in order, named his successor, said what he had to say, and went. Others describe a man who had been drinking heavily for a long time before that night, who was not entirely himself, and whose departure had the quality of something done in a bad hour, rather than after consideration. Both versions exist inside the same saga tradition, and the chapter has never reconciled them, which is worth marking for what it says about oral history. A written record would have settled this. A tradition carried by skulls preserves the version each company found meaningful, and the Space Wolves have been living with two incompatible accounts of the most important night in their history for 100 centuries without either being resolved or discarded. The companions. He did not go alone, and who went with him has never been established. The accounts agree that Russ left the Fang with companions. They disagree on the number, on the names, and on whether the group included wolf lords, or ordinary brothers, or something else. What is agreed is that none of them came back either, which produces a small permanent hole in the chapter's records. A number of brothers walked out with their primarch and vanished, and the chapter cannot say with confidence who they were. For an institution whose entire memory system depends on somebody being there to witness and report, that gap is the most complete failure of the tradition in its history. The one departure that mattered most had no skald present to record it properly. What waiting does to a chapter. We close on the effect of the promise, because 10,000 years of expecting somebody has shaped this chapter as thoroughly as the curse has. A chapter that believes its primarch is coming back organizes itself differently from one that knows he is gone. The Space Wolves have never sought a replacement for what Russ was. The office of Great Wolf is command, and no Great Wolf has ever been treated as a substitute for the Primarch. The position is caretaker, in a sense the chapter would not put that way, and clearly means. They have also never adapted the way other chapters adapted. The Blood Angels built 10,000 years of ritual around their loss. The Dark Angels built an apparatus of concealment around theirs. The Space Wolves built nothing, because in their understanding nothing has ended, and the practical result is a chapter that fights as though the war has a conclusion coming. The Wolftime is a real event in their doctrine, scheduled by nobody, arriving when it arrives, and the brothers in that mountain expect either to see it themselves or to leave someone behind who will. Whether Russ is coming back is a question this account cannot answer. What can be answered is what believing it has done, and the answer is that of all the first founding lines. This is the one with no grief in it. Sleep well. Tomorrow we look at the chapter that had to keep going without him. The chapter has 12 great companies. Every Space Wolf knows this. Every Imperial record states it. 12 Wolf Lords, 12 formations, and a Great Wolf above them, and the number has been 12 since the Legion divided after the heresy. There were 13. Tonight we look at the one that stopped being counted, and at what was in it. What happened to the ones who turned? Start with the problem the company was the solution to. The second night of this account described the curse. A Space Wolf who loses the fight against his own blood becomes a Wulfen, permanently, and no known method restores him. What the chapter did with those brothers has varied across its history, and the honest answer for most of that history is that it hid them. The Wulfen were the chapter's shame in a way the curse itself was not. Fenrisians are comfortable with the wolf in the blood. It is part of what they are, and they drink it on purpose. What they were not comfortable with was showing the Imperium what happens when the wolf wins. So the afflicted were quietly taken off the rolls, and the chapter's official line to outsiders was that no such thing occurred. An inquisition that suspected a chapter of harboring mutants would have grounds. The Space Wolves knew it, and concealed accordingly, and this account has already described how that decision plays out for another chapter in another series. The 13. At some point after the heresy, a formation of them was assembled. The 13th Great Company was made up of Space Wolves who had succumbed, kept together rather than destroyed, under a Wolf Lord who could still command them, and it went into the eye. The circumstances of that departure have never been established. Some accounts place it during the scouring, some at the time Russ walked out of the Fang, some later. What is agreed is that the company entered the eye and did not come back, and that the chapter's official count dropped to 12. The company was struck from the rolls. Its Wolf Lord's name went with it. And a chapter whose entire memory system is oral stopped telling that part. What they were doing in there. The theories about the 13's purpose run in several directions, and the setting has kept all of them alive. The chapter's own understanding, held within its senior ranks, is that the company went in on an operation. Something in the eye required attention that could not be given from outside, and the Wulfen were the formation best suited to a war fought in conditions no ordinary Astartes could endure. A second reading connects them to Russ. He went into the eye. They went into the eye. Under this reading, the 13th followed their primarch, or accompanied him, or was sent ahead of him, and whatever he is doing in there they have been doing alongside him for 10,000 years. A third reading is bleaker, and the chapter does not encourage it. The Wulfen were a problem the chapter could not solve and could not afford to have discovered, and sending them into the Eye of Terror removed the problem without requiring anyone to give the order to kill their own brothers. All three readings are compatible with the recorded facts. The chapter has never clarified. The warp does not run on clocks. Something happened to the 13th in there that makes the third reading harder to sustain, and it is a property of the eye rather than a decision by anybody. Time in the warp does not proceed the way it proceeds outside. A journey of days can consume centuries. A campaign can run for what feels like a season and emerge into a galaxy 1,000 years older. By the Imperium's reckoning, the 13th has been inside that region for 100 centuries. By their own, nobody knows. They may have experienced a fraction of it. They may have experienced far more, and the men in that formation, who went in as space wolves, who had lost a fight with their own blood, have spent that span fighting in a place where the enemy is made of the same stuff as the thing inside them. They came back. And then, in the era Indomitus, they returned. The Wulfen emerged from the Eye of Terror in numbers, in the period around the opening of the Great Rift, and they came back to a chapter that had spent 100 centuries not mentioning them. The chapter's reaction was not straightforward. Some within the Space Wolves read the arrival as a sign. The Wulfen returning at the moment the galaxy tore open is the kind of event a chapter with a prophecy attached to it takes seriously. The Wolftime is coming, Russ said, and something that vanished with his era came back at the moment the Imperium's era ended. Others read it as a catastrophe. The chapter's most closely held secret walked back into its own halls, visibly in front of allies. What they are like. The returned Wulfen are described in the chapter's own material, and the description does not soften anything. They are enormous. They are more beast than man in shape and in manner. They fight with claws and teeth as readily as with weapons, and their control on a battlefield is limited to what a wolf priest can impose by presence rather than by order. They do not speak, or speak rarely. Whatever remains of the men they were is buried under what the curse and 10,000 years in the eye have made of them, and they are still space wolves. That is the chapter's position, and it has not moved from it. These are brothers. They entered that place as brothers, and the chapter will not disown them for what the blood did, which is a far kinder position than the one the chapter held for the previous 100 centuries, when it concealed the same condition and pretended it did not occur. What it cost the chapter. The consequences of the return arrived quickly, and they were bad. The Inquisition noticed. A chapter that had spent 10,000 years denying it produced mutants, was now fielding them openly, and the Ordo Malleus had been suspicious of the Space Wolves' gene line long before there was visible evidence. Relations deteriorated, investigations opened, and the chapter's position that the Wulfen are brothers and will be treated as such is not a position the Imperium's institutions can accept without conceding something they have never conceded to anybody. Grey Knight's involvement, inquisitorial censure, and the long-running question of whether the Space Wolves' gene seed should be permitted to continue all sharpened at once. The chapter has held its ground. It has held it by being useful enough that nobody can afford the fight, which is the same arrangement that has protected it for 100 centuries. Why this is the chapter's real secret. We close on the comparison this account has been building toward, because it separates the Space Wolves from the two other chapters this channel has covered at length. The Dark Angels conceal a treachery. Their secret is about what some of them did. The Blood Angels carry a flaw. Their affliction is a tragedy inflicted on them by their primarch's death, and they grieve it. The Space Wolves' secret is neither. It is not a betrayal, and they do not mourn it. What they have hidden for 10,000 years is a set of brothers who lost a fight that every one of them has fought, and who are therefore not different in kind from any Space Wolf standing in that mountain. Every wolf who looks at a Wulfen is looking at an outcome he came within an unmeasurable margin of himself. That is why the concealment was never quite shame, and why the chapter's decision to take them back was possible in a way that no comparable decision would be for the Dark Angels. Nothing about the Wulfen makes them other. They are the alternative result of the same night in the snow. The priesthood that was waiting. One office within the chapter had a role in all of this that the Space Wolves rarely discuss with outsiders. The Wolf Priests handle the curse. They are the ones who read a brother in the field, who recognize the signs before anyone else does, and who make the decisions about what happens next. A Wolf Priest attends the initiation described on our second night. He is present when an aspirant goes into the change, and present when whatever comes back emerges from the snow. He is the person who decides which category the returning figure belongs to. And in the field, when a brother of 2 centuries standing starts to slip, the Wolf Priest is the one who assesses him. Consider the position that puts a man in. His duties combine spiritual leadership, medical care, recruitment, and the judgment of which brothers are still brothers. Every Space Wolf in his company knows that this is the man who will make that call about him, one day. And every Wolf Priest knows the same thing about himself. They are not exempt. A Wolf Priest carries the Canis Helix like everybody else, and the man who assesses the afflicted may be assessed by his own successor. Why they went back for them. The decision to accept the returning Wulfen deserves examination, because it was not obvious, and it cost the chapter a great deal. The alternative was available, and it would have been easier. Deny them. Destroy them quietly. Report nothing, and preserve the arrangement that had held for 100 centuries. The chapter did not take it, and the reasoning that has come out of the Fang since is Fenrisian, rather than theological. A brother who fell is still a brother. The tribes below do not abandon their dead on the ice, and the chapter that recruits from those tribes does not abandon men who went into a fight and lost it. Whatever came out of the eye had gone in wearing the chapter's colors. There is also the practical argument, which the chapter's leadership has made in less sentimental language. The Wulfen are formidable. In a galaxy that has been cut in half and is losing, a formation of creatures that can fight in the eye of terror for 10,000 years is an asset no commander turns away. Both reasons are real. The chapter has led with the first and relied on the second. What the Great Wolf has to manage. The current leadership's position is worth stating because it is the hardest command problem in the chapter's history. Logan Grimnar has been Great Wolf for a very long time. He is old by the standards of any Astartes, and he has held the office through the events described tonight and the ones coming tomorrow. What he inherited was a chapter with a hidden condition. What he now runs is a chapter with that condition standing in its own halls in front of allies, an inquisition asking questions it has wanted to ask for millennia, and a formation of returned Wulfen whose behavior cannot be guaranteed. His handling of it has been to refuse every offer to compromise. The Wulfen stay. The chapter's business remains the chapter's business. Outside authorities are told what the chapter chooses to tell them, and the answer to further inquiry has been consistent. It has worked so far. Whether it continues to work depends on how badly the Imperium needs the Space Wolves in any given decade, which is the arrangement this chapter has been living inside since the Codex. The question nobody in the chapter asks. We close on something the Space Wolves have never put into words, because their whole culture is built to avoid putting it into words. If the Wulfen came back at the moment the Great Rift opened, and if that reads to the chapter as the Wolftime approaching, then they are treating the worst thing about themselves as good news. Follow that through. The curse takes brothers at random, permanently, and has done since the Legion existed. It is the price of everything the Canis Helix gives them, and a chapter that has been managing it as a private affliction for 10,000 years has now started reading its return as the opening move of the event its primarch promised, which means the affliction has been promoted. What was a shame to be hidden is now a portent to be watched, and a body of brothers has gone from an embarrassment to a portent in the space of a few decades, without anything about their condition changing. The chapter has not examined this. Fenrisian culture does not go in for examining things, and a chapter that reads its own worst outcome as a signal of its founder's return has reasons of its own for leaving the reading where it is. Sleep well. Tomorrow, the chapter as it stands today, and what the Imperium has decided to do about it. 6 knights have described a fighting force with a clean record. Not one of the great companies has ever gone over. No wolf lord has taken his men to the enemy. From the Crusade to the present day, in a setting where almost every institution has failed at least once, this one has not. And the Imperium has spent that entire span regarding them as a problem. Tonight we look at why and at what the chapter has done about it. The charges. Set out the case against them, because it is more substantial than the chapter's admirers admit. They keep psychers and call them something else. The rune priests are psychers by any functional definition. The chapter backed the prohibition at Nicaea, and its position that Fenrisian runecraft is a different thing has never satisfied anybody outside Fenris. They ignore the Codex. 12 great companies under a great wolf is the old Legion arrangement wearing a new label. And our 5th night set out how the chapter has managed that trick since Leman first wrote the thing. They produce mutants. What the blood does to a proportion of them was covered on our 2nd and 6th nights. The chapter kept it out of sight for 100 centuries, and in the present era, it stands in their halls where visitors can see it, and their gene seed is unstable. The Wolf brothers proved it, and the Imperium's response was to forbid any further attempt. Every one of those charges is true. Halt what the charges miss. And now the other side. because the chapter's record answers most of it. The rune priests have never produced a Prospero. In 10,000 years of a chapter using psychic power under a Fenrisian name, no incident traceable to them has damaged the Imperium, and the chapter's own strictures on its priests are severe by any standard. The Codex Defiance has cost the Imperium nothing. The great companies fight and win, and have never been used against the Imperium by an ambitious commander, which was the entire risk the Codex was written to prevent. The Wulfen have never turned on the Imperium either. They have been thrown against its enemies, inside the eye and out of it, for longer than most chapters have existed. And the gene seed's instability affects the Space Wolves and nobody else. The line does not spread. It cannot spread by Imperial decree, and the chapter has never asked to, which produces the position underneath all 6 previous knights. The Space Wolves are guilty of every charge and have never once done the thing the charges are supposed to predict. Why that is not enough. The Imperium's institutions do not work on outcomes, and understanding why explains the whole relationship. The Inquisition assesses risk rather than record. An organization that has not yet failed is an organization that might, and the Ordo Malleus does not wait for a chapter to fall before treating the possibility as actionable. The Adeptus Terra assesses compliance. A chapter that ignores the Codex is a chapter that has demonstrated it will ignore instructions, and the fact that it has ignored them harmlessly for 10,000 years is not the point. And the Ecclesiarchy assesses doctrine. A chapter whose homeworld worships its own warriors as sky gods, whose priests commune with spirits, and whose recruits are taken from a feral population, is not observing the Imperial Creed in any form Terra recognizes. 3 institutions, 3 separate objections, and none of them turns on whether the Space Wolves have done anything at all. The months of shame. One episode is worth stating in full, because it shows how far this can go. In the era after the Second War for Armageddon, the Inquisition moved against the Space Wolves over the chapter's conduct concerning the survivors of that campaign. What the Inquisition wanted was the elimination of those survivors on the grounds of possible contamination. What the chapter did was refuse and shelter them. What followed was open conflict between a loyal Space Marine chapter and the Inquisition, with Grey Knights involved, and it ran long enough to acquire a name within the chapter's own tradition. It ended without either side destroying the other, and the terms of the ending are not recorded in a form outsiders can consult. Consider what that episode establishes. The Space Wolves will fight the Imperium's own agencies, rather than hand over people they consider theirs. They have done it, and every Inquisitor who has looked at the chapter since has known that this is a formation that will refuse, in arms, if pushed, which is precisely the behavior that makes the Inquisition suspicious, produced by a chapter defending civilians the Inquisition wanted killed. How the chapter survives it. The Space Wolves have held their position across 100 centuries by a method that is simple and slightly ugly. They are too useful to move against. A chapter that fields 12 great companies of exceptional warriors that will go anywhere, that has never refused a legitimate call, and that is available for the assignments others hesitate over, is an asset the Imperium cannot afford to spend on a dispute about doctrine. Every institution that has considered acting against them has run the same calculation and reached the same conclusion. The cost of the fight exceeds the cost of the irregularity. So the chapter continues. Its psychers continue. Its structure continues. Its Wulfen stand in its halls, and the objections are registered and filed and nothing happens. and this has been the arrangement since before most of the Imperium's current institutions took their present form. What they think of the Imperium. The chapter's own view deserves a hearing, because it is less deferential than most Astartes positions. The Space Wolves serve the Emperor. They call him the All-Father in Fenrisian terms, and their loyalty to him is total and uncomplicated. Their loyalty to the Imperium's institutions is a different matter. They regard the Administratum as an obstacle. They regard the Ecclesiarchy's version of the Emperor as something Russ would have found funny. They cooperate with the Inquisition when they have to, and lie to it when they judge it necessary. And they do not consider any of this disloyal, because in their understanding the Imperium's bureaucracy is a set of arrangements built by men, and the All-Father is not. That distinction is the chapter's whole political position. Serve the Emperor, fight his enemies, ignore the paperwork, the theologians, and anybody who arrives at Fenris with a writ. The relationships that work. Not everything about their standing is hostile, and the exceptions are informative. The Blood Angels get on with them. The two have fought side by side many times without friction, and the reason is not hard to find. Each line carries something in the blood that takes brothers away, and each knows what the other is managing. With the Imperial Fists, there is professional regard. The Dark Angels do not. Both chapters date the ill feeling to the heresy era. Neither has ever aired it in full, and our third night gave the Wolves half of the story. And whenever Ultramarines and Space Wolves share a room, the Codex is in there with them. The pattern is that the Space Wolves get on with chapters that have carried something, and badly with chapters that write manuals. What the suspicion has cost. We close on the price, because 10,000 years of being distrusted has done something to this chapter. It has made them insular. A formation that expects to be investigated does not volunteer information, and the Space Wolves' habit of telling outsiders as little as possible is a learned response to 100 centuries of scrutiny. It has made the concealment of the Wulfen necessary, and the concealment then became the thing that most justified the scrutiny. A chapter hiding a mutation is indistinguishable from a chapter with something to hide, and the chapter was hiding it because of what would happen if it were found. And it has meant that the Space Wolves have no allies inside the Imperium's institutions. Other chapters have patrons, arrangements, friendly inquisitors, understandings with the Administratum. The Space Wolves have their own usefulness and nothing else, which is a position of considerable strength and no security whatsoever. The day the Imperium decides it can spare them, none of the past 10,000 years will count for anything. They know that. It has not changed how they behave in any particular. What Fenris costs the Administratum. One friction point rarely gets mentioned, and it is the most imperial thing in this account. Fenris is a feral world. Its population lives in tribes, keeps no records, pays no tithe, and has no idea it belongs to a galactic empire. By the Administratum's rules, that is a problem requiring correction. A world within imperial space is expected to contribute. Materials, manpower, taxes, compliance with the imperial creed. Fenris contributes nothing and is administered by nobody. The Space Wolves will not permit it to change. Their reasoning is practical, and they have never disguised it. The chapter's recruits come from that population, produced by that world, selected by conditions no civilized planet could reproduce. Bring Fenris into compliance, build cities, stabilize the food supply, install an imperial governor, and within 3 generations the tribes stop producing the young men the chapter needs. So the chapter holds its recruiting world in a state of permanent pre-industrial hardship on purpose, and defends that arrangement against its own imperium. Millions of people live short and violent lives so that 1,000 warriors can exist. The chapter knows this. Its position is that the alternative is worse for everybody, and the imperium has never quite been able to argue with it. Their own astropaths and nobody else's. A small structural detail says more about the chapter's independence than any doctrinal argument. Most chapters rely on the Imperium's communication network, astropathic relays, navigator houses, the whole apparatus that the Adeptus Terra maintains and controls. Access to that apparatus is a lever. A chapter that depends on Imperial communications can be isolated, delayed, or left uninformed by anybody with authority over the relays. The Space Wolves maintain their own. Their rune priests handle a substantial part of the chapter's long-range communication. Using Fenrisian methods, the Imperium neither supplies nor supervises, which means the chapter cannot be cut off. It receives what it chooses to receive, sends what it chooses to send, and no administrative authority sits between a wolf lord in the field and the Fang. For an institution as suspicious of the Imperium's bureaucracy as this one, tradition has nothing to do with it. That is infrastructure, maintained on purpose, for the one situation the chapter has never stopped anticipating. How they fight. Something about their conduct on the battlefield belongs here, because it feeds the reputation more than any doctrinal dispute. The Space Wolves close. Whatever the tactical situation, a great company's instinct is to reach the enemy and fight him at arm's length, and their equipment reflects it. Bloodclaws with chainswords, Wolfguard in Terminator plate, Thunderwolf cavalry, Wulfen when they are fielded. That approach produces results, and it produces casualties, and Allied commanders who expected a Codex pattern assault have found themselves supporting an advance they did not plan for. It also produces something the Imperium finds harder to categorize. Space Wolves take pleasure in fighting, not grim satisfaction in duty performed, enjoyment, visible, expressed loudly, in the middle of an engagement. Other Astartes find this unnerving. The Imperium's ideal space marine is a solemn instrument. The Space Wolves are extremely good at their work and obviously enjoying themselves, and there is no category in Imperial doctrine for that. The charge nobody makes out loud. We close on the objection that sits under all the formal ones and never appears in any document. The Space Wolves are frightening, not dangerous in the way every Astartes chapter is dangerous. Frightening in a manner that has to do with what they are rather than what they might do. Men with predator senses and a beast under the surface, drawn from a feral population, organized into war bands, led by a chapter that does what it likes and has never lost an argument with anybody. An inquisitor who files a report about gene seed instability is writing down the acceptable version of a reaction that started somewhere else. The ecclesiarch who objects to Fenrisian practice is doing the same, and the chapter is aware of it and does nothing to soften the impression. And our opening night gave the reason. When a reputation for roughness is already established, nobody bothers to look past it. They have been trading on that for 10,000 years. The barbarian manor is partly real and partly a door held shut, and behind it is a chapter that has kept its psychers, its structure, its afflicted brothers and its feral world, against an imperium that would have taken all four from anybody else. Sleep well. Tomorrow, the last night, and the thing they are all waiting for. 7 nights ago, this account opened on a planet that reshapes itself by the season, and on tribes who read the schedule or drown. Tonight we finish with what the chapter is waiting for, and with the question of whether the waiting has been worth anything. What he promised. Return to the hall, and to the words he left. He gave his wolf lords 3 things that night: where he was going, a name for what was coming, and a promise to be present when it arrived. Then he took a few companions and left, and 100 centuries of chapter history have rested on that promise ever since. Consider what kind of statement it is. Not a plan with a date, not an instruction. A promise given in a hall by a man who then removed himself from all further contact, and no mechanism by which anybody could confirm it or act on it. Each great wolf has taken it on with the office. Each wolf lord has handed it down, and everything about how this chapter carries itself, the absence of mourning, the good humor, the certainty that the war ends somewhere, stands on a sentence nobody has been able to check since the evening it was spoken. What the Wolftime is supposed to be. The chapter's understanding of the event is thinner than its confidence about it, and the thinness is worth stating. The Wolftime is the end, the final battle, the last war, the moment when everything the Imperium has been holding back arrives at once, and the All-Father takes the field. Russ returns for it. The Space Wolves fight in it, and whatever happens afterward is not something the chapter's doctrine addresses, because the doctrine stops there. That is the whole of it. No date, no sign to watch for that anyone agrees on, no description of what the battle involves or where it takes place. What the chapter has is a promise, a name for the event, and an instruction to be ready. What has been read as a sign? And in the era Indomitus, the signs started arriving, or seemed to. The Great Rift opened and cut the galaxy in half. The 13th Company came back out of the Eye of Terror after 10,000 years, as our 6th night described. Leman returned, the Lion returned. Caria fell, and the Imperium entered a period its own institutions describe as the beginning of the end. Within the chapter, the reading was immediate. Something is starting. The Wulfen came back, the galaxy tore, the dead primarchs are walking, and the Wolftime that Russ named is arriving. Whether that reading is correct is beyond anything this account can establish. What can be observed is the effect. A chapter that has been waiting for 100 centuries now believes the wait is ending, and a formation that expects its founder within its own lifetimes behaves differently from one that expects him in some indefinite future. Where he might be. The setting has never confirmed what happened to Russ, and the available possibilities deserve laying out. He may be in the Eye of Terror still, fighting precisely as the chapter believes. Time in there runs differently, as our 6th night established, and a campaign that has consumed 10,000 years outside may be a great deal shorter from inside. He may be dead. A Primarch is difficult to kill and not impossible, and the warp is the one place where the difficulty reduces. Nothing about his departure guaranteed his survival, and nobody has heard from him since. He may be somewhere else entirely. Various accounts across the setting place figures who might be Russ in places that have nothing to do with the Eye, and none of them has been confirmed. Or he may be returning. The era Indomitus has produced 2 Primarchs already, and the Imperium's own current period is the one in which the impossible has started happening again. The chapter holds the 1st and 4th. It does not entertain the 2nd, Kopunt. What the waiting has produced. We can now say what the promise has done, and the accounting is mixed in a way that reflects well on them. It has kept them whole. a chapter that expects its primarch back, does not fall into despair, does not lose its purpose, and does not decay the way institutions decay when their founding figure is gone and known to be gone. 100 centuries on, this is recognizably the same chapter Russ left, and the promise is the reason. It has made them cheerful, which this account has kept returning to, and which has no parallel elsewhere. Every other first founding chapter carries something. Grief, shame, an affliction they mourn. The Space Wolves carry a curse they drink on purpose, and a founder they expect back. And the result is a formation that enjoys its work in a galaxy where almost nothing does. And it has cost them nothing that can be measured. Whatever the truth about Russ, the belief has produced a chapter that fights well, holds together, and has never turned, which raises the question this account will leave open. If the promise was false, or if Russ died in the warp centuries ago, the chapter that grew around the expectation is still the chapter it became. The waiting worked whether or not the thing waited for is coming. What they are underneath. We can also say what this series has been describing, because it has never been about wolves. It is about a bargain. A young man on Fenris takes a cup, loses himself to what is in it, and goes out into the ice with nothing. Whether he comes back as a person depends on a strength of mind nobody can measure in advance. Those who do return receive senses no other Astartes possesses, a frame stronger than theirs, and a brotherhood that will not put them aside. What they keep alongside it is the animal, held down for the rest of a long life, capable of rising during any engagement in any century of service, with nothing to warn them. Every Space Wolf made that trade. The ones in the halls, the ones in the black armor of the Wulfen, the wolf priests who assessed them, and Russ himself, who was the source of the thing they all drink. The chapter's whole character follows from having accepted it. They are informal, because protocol impresses nobody who has met the thing inside himself. They are loyal, because the brotherhood is what the bargain bought. They are cheerful, because the alternative to enjoying this life is enduring it, and they have 400 years either way. Good night. On a world that sinks and rises, there is a mountain that stays. Inside it, a chapter keeps the vigil it has kept for 100 centuries. Warriors drink from a cup that will one day take some of them. Skalds compose accounts of men who died well. Wolf priests go down to the ice to collect the worthy dead, and the tribes below give up their sons and call it an honor. In one hall, a dreadnought sleeps. He was there for the crusade, for Prospero, for the last feast, and when they wake him, he tells them what he saw, and there is nobody else alive who can. And somewhere out beyond the light, in a place where time does not run straight, a man with 2 wolves beside him is doing whatever he went there to do. He said he would come back. They have never once considered that he might not. Good night, my friend.